The fairy sleeps curled on a giant luminous lotus at the mirror-still lake center as dawn arrives. The fairy awakens on the lotus as her eyes open and the petals bloom, releasing golden pollen. The fairy rises and glides across floating blossoms, sending light rings across the lake. The fairy steps onto the obsidian boulder, activating its runes as dawn strengthens around her.
The fairy turns and beckons the fire phoenix, which adjusts course and flares wings overhead.
The fairy approaches the fire phoenix, and their elements merge gently on the glowing boulder. The fairy lifts off and skims low over the elemental stream, splitting it into 4 distinct bands. The fairy reaches the shallow valley and watches the crystal deer herd drink from the stream. The fairy lands among the crystal deer and shares a gentle moment of connection with the nearest doe. The fairy flies along the stream, tapping waystone pillars that awaken as she crests the ridge into the thermal. The fairy meets Gem the Druid at the Great Elder Oak, where green gold energy radiates into the forest roots. The fairy joins Gem the Druid, and their combined energies braid into the forest root network. The fairy bursts from the ancient forest with new green-gold aura and races low across the enchanted plain. The fairy swoops over the crystal deer herd, whose antlers now cast sharper rainbows across the valley. The fairy rises on a thermal, then dives toward the distant lake from the crystal deer valley. The fairy lands on her lotus and absorbs solar energy through her spread wings at the lake center.
The fairy glides to meet Gem the Druid on the grassy bank as a warm gust sweeps the plain.
Gem the Druid and the fairy blend elemental waters, creating a procession of glowing teal orbs. The fairy and Gem the Druid release overlapping energy pulses that enhance the entire meadow. The fairy rises and fires twin beams from her wings that fully activate the obsidian boulder's runes. The fairy descends and orbits the fire phoenix as their auras merge briefly around the glowing boulder. An emerald dragonfly perches on a grass blade, refracting light while riding its gentle sway. The enchanted plain vibrates in perfect harmony as energy beams link Gem the Druid and the fairy across the lake. The fairy spots a mysterious amber glow inside the ancient forest and shifts to alert vigilance.
The fairy stands defensive as a massive white unicorn emerges from the ancient forest, its amber horn blazing.
The fairy flies to the white unicorn and presses her palms to its muzzle in a burst of blended turquoise amber light. The fairy gestures excitedly to Gem the Druid, who approaches the white unicorn with her staff raised. The fairy leaps onto The white unicorn and the fairy gallop toward the ancient runestone circle at the exact center of the enchanted plain. The fairy and the white unicorn enter the runestone circle, triggering a synchronized surge through all 12 pillars. The fairy channels zenith sunlight at the center, turning the runestone circle into a massive resonating instrument. The fairy and the white unicorn exit the runestone circle as the crystallized energy archway shatters into suspended amber fragments. The fairy and the white unicorn gallop away from the circle and plunge through the elemental stream in an explosion of colored spray.
The white unicorn's hoof strike creates a starburst of elemental color and ascending bubbles in the stream.
The fairy connects with the white unicorn, then spirals upward as the creature follows in a synchronized vertical helix. The fairy and white unicorn perform a synchronized spiral dance, creating a visible double helix beacon across the enchanted plain.
The fairy descends in a corkscrew and remounts the white unicorn, merging their energy trails into a comet tail braid.
The fairy and unicorn pass beneath the fire phoenix, exchanging energy as the fire thread band expands in the stream ahead. The fairy reaches into the fire band, and 3 elemental koi arc over her hand, trailing violet auroras.
Come closer, little ones. Let me see your fire.
The fairy flies toward Gem the Druid's green beam, and their energies merge into deep teal as she descends.
The fairy joins Gem the Druid, and their combined energies release a massive oak leaf firework above the circle.
Thank you, child. The circle is complete.
The fairy leaves the runestone circle and walks across the meadow, now enriched with green microgardens and sparkling pollen. The fairy sits beside the white unicorn at the stream and watches the elemental koi play in lazy arcs. The fairy and the white unicorn walk downstream, leaving a trail of turquoise and amber prints as the afternoon light warms the plain. The fairy exits the runestone circle into the enriched meadow as the first shadows return to the plain.
Blazing! Launch, everyone!
The fairy tumbles from the collapsing tower and lands as the meadow fully restores around her. The fairy and white unicorn fly and gallop east together as the restored plain glows in sunset light.
The plain is whole again, thanks to you.
The fairy and Gem the Druid walk east as twilight deepens and the plain settles into restored peace. The fairy walks through the blooming night orchid field as twilight turns the eastern meadow into a violet sea. The fairy flies to the silver wolf on its hilltop, and they share a moment of silent recognition in the twilight. The fairy glides back into the night orchid field with a new silver shimmer on her wings as twilight deepens. The fairy rejoins the glowing white unicorn as warm yellow lights emerge from the ancient forest in the deepening twilight. The fairy enters the giant firefly swarm as they form a golden orbiting globe around her in the twilight. The fairy releases a cluster of giant fireflies skyward, and the entire swarm pulses in unison, merging violet and amber into pink-gold light. The fairy and Gem the Druid share a moment of connection as their energies merge into white light. The fairy Gem the Druid and the white unicorn walk together toward the lake as the night sky reveals its full starry canopy. The fairy lands on the reopening lotus as her wings dim to a gentle blue, matching the starry night.
The fairy rests on the reopening lotus, while Gem and the unicorn watch from shore, as fireflies synchronize their glow above the lake.
Gem the Druid walks the lakeshore, collecting violet light from the night orchids to guide them into night rest. Gem the Druid releases the violet sleep signal into the lake and plants her staff to command the plain to rest.